Welcome to Communicology. I'm Richard Talbert. I'm an associate professor of communication and media, and I love studying how people communicate. I also love studying how communication and culture intersect. Today, what I'd like to do is dig a little bit more into the First Amendment, this time talking about the right to peaceable assembly. With all protests that go on around this country, at any given moment, it's kind of interesting to wonder, well, what's legal and what's not legal, and should all protests be allowed, or should they be stopped, or can people block a road? Those kind of questions that people wrestle with because you see them in the news and people protest for a variety of reasons, and we wonder, well, what are there limits? How can we understand what's going on, what we see on TV? So I want to talk about those things. Now, when I've talked about other issues with the First Amendment in the past, it's important to remember in the First Amendment, it starts off with Congress shall make no law restricting or abridging, and you start looking at those kind of things and think, well, okay, if they can make no law, that means people can protest all they want anywhere, any place, any time, is your quick thought on that. But the truth of it is we have to look at all the wording and understand those pieces and parts and how they fit. We also have to understand that no right is absolute in that it exists in a vacuum. Every right we have has to live in harmony with the other rights. So if I have freedom of speech and I have some other, like a freedom that I might someone else might have, like their right to their privacy, or the right to their own private property, those things combine and clash, and you have to figure out, well, whose right supersedes. So if someone comes into my private property and starts running their mouth, am I allowed to silence their speech? Well, they're on private property. Therefore, I get to make the rules. My right to my private property supersede their right to speech. So it's not that you see a case where government is restricting speech. It's a situation where you have one right and another right coming into play. So we have to keep those things in mind. So there's a difference between public and public being defined from a governmental legal standpoint, meaning government owned is public, not go out in public. I'm out, hang out with in where the people are. That's not, when we think public, we tend to think of it that way. But public legally is typically considered government owned entities like the city park. That's public. Private, meaning it's privately owned. That could be something as simple as my house, which is obvious, that's a private thing. Or it could be something also a little bit more, where we get a little bit fuzzier, like, say, a privately held college or university. Obviously the general public moves through that area, and the general public is wanted in that area because, well, colleges need people to come to it, but it's still private property. And so a government funded university versus a private university, now you're looking public, private. So when it comes to protest, it's the same kind of basic concept. The first thing is, when you look at the tail end of the First Amendment, you see the right of the people to peaceably assemble, and also the right for people to petition their government for a redress of grievances. What that big mouthful is basically that if you don't like your government, you're allowed to speak up against it. Important thing with the first part of that is that you have the right to peaceably assemble. Well, what is peaceable? And of course, this could always be fuzzy depending on your version of what's peaceable. Am I allowed to march in silence? Well, that sounds peaceful. What about, am I allowed to block a street? Is that peaceable? Am I allowed to shout? Am I allowed to yell? Am I allowed to blow a whistle? Am I allowed to use a bullhorn? You start seeing where things can maybe get a little bit fuzzy. Obviously, if you're doing things like turning cars upside down and setting them on fire, not very peaceable. If you're throwing rocks through business windows, not very peaceable. So you can see that kind of a thing. If I'm having major clashes with other people, if I'm having fights or using some kind of a weapon against somebody, Obviously, that's pretty clear on what's being peaceable. Those other things that I mentioned earlier get to be a little bit more fuzzy, especially when it comes down to taking a street. Now, when we talk about public space, the government pays for and owns and runs the street. So that's public. So if I get to protest and the government shall make no law, public spaces, that's fair game, right? And then it gets a little bit more fuzzy because as I move away from the street, well, how far am I allowed to be? Like, can I go on the sidewalk? Maybe. It depends, because most cities, when they set up streets, they don't own simply the street from curb to curb. They typically have further than that. They have what's known as a cartway, which basically they have this right-of-way passage so that if they ever want to widen the street, or if they ever want to bury or utility lines or put up poles, they own that. They don't have to try to buy that land later. They try to take this much land from the beginning. That way, whenever they need to use it, they have it, and they can already just start to put everything in play so they can bury their lines, run their sewage. They can do drainage ditches. They could put up utility poles, whatever they want to do in that area. So they've got all this space that they tend to have. So it's not just the street when we're talking about public. It could include an extra 5 feet on each side. It could be 10 feet. It could be 30 feet. It depends. So one of those things, if you're thinking, I want to protest something, or we want to have a march for some kind of thing, and it could be whatever the topic happens to be. You don't have to have a specific topic to have a peaceable assembly. I mean, assemblies just means you're just getting together. You don't even have to protest. You can just assemble. So if you get a group of people together, you want to have a silent march through your town about any issue. Doesn't matter what it is. Well, it's important to think and ask, well, who owns where we're going to go? So if I'm on the street, that's obvious. If I'm on the sidewalk, not as obvious. Maybe it's worth checking into. Most occasions it's safe, but I want to be clear, it's not guaranteed. And then obviously as you go beyond the sidewalk, it's further than that. But what if I want to wander through business parking lots and stuff? Well, now you're into private. Once you leave that cartway, you're in the private property. So you would, by law, need permission, because now you're violating their rights by trying to exercise your rights. So it's going to come down to a situation, well, I want to have my right to peaceably assemble or protest, either one of those or both of them at the same time. Well, that private property owner, he has rights too. And before you go onto his property, you better have permission, because now you're trampling his rights. And the courts are going to have to wrestle with who's right in that situation. So let's say you get everything figured out. I want to do a peaceable assembly on public land. You figure out, yep, the sidewalks are good. We know everything's good, and we want to do it. Am I okay then? Well, Congress shall make no law. That sounds like I'm okay, right? So you do it. But the problem is that's not always the case there either, because if you have this large mass of people that's taking up the sidewalk, can other people use the sidewalk? Oh, yeah, now you're blocking traffic for people to be able to walk on that sidewalk. What if you're going through a downtown? Can people use the sidewalk to get to those businesses? Don't those people have a right to get to businesses and do commerce, or just to travel? You're marching north-south, and someone's trying to walk south-north, and you're blocking them. Don't they have the right to have a passageway? See, now you can see where things can get really convoluted, like whose right wins. And the easiest way to avoid those issues is to seek permission. And I know you're sitting there thinking, wait a minute, why should I get permission? Because if Congress should make no law restricting, again, you have rights fighting against other rights. So permission is one of those things that is a fairly newer concept when it comes to it. And, newer in American history. For most people, it's back before they were alive. And what it does, it comes from the case of Cox v. New Hampshire from 1941. So go all the way back to 1941, and you have a situation where you have Jehovah's Witnesses wanted to have a parade, and they were wanting to go down a sidewalk, and the town restricted them and created a legal battle. And it was determined that, yes, the town can restrict parades. And it based it on three things. It's a reasonable time, place, and manner. So, in other words, there is a reasonable time. When is a good time to have a parade? Obviously, if you're going to have a Christmas parade, it should probably be on or before Christmas, but more so than that, are there certain times of the day when it's good to have a parade or not, or certain times of the week? Like a Saturday is a lot less, crazy downtown, than during a weekday. A weekday evening is less busy than during prime business hours during the weekday. So there's time, then there's place. Well, where's an appropriate place? Because there's some places that aren't really appropriate. If there's say you have an old town where the buildings are built right up to the property line, and there's a very small sidewalk, and then a very busy street, and you have a bunch of people trying to move down that, you create all kinds of hazards. So even for the people who are wanting to protest, it's hazardous for them. So you can say, well, maybe this isn't the best place to have this kind of protest. Maybe you should have it over here at this other location. You'd be safer and better, in that regard. So place can be restricted too. And then also, as I mentioned, the manner. What do you want to do? A parade. Well, what do you mean by a parade? Just like a line of people walking through? Everyone's going to have instruments? You're going to have floats? What do you mean by parade? How many people are we talking? Is this going to be like a 5-mile long parade? Or is it just 50 people just walking through? Are you going to have banners? What's it going to look like? Is it going to be disruptive to whatever's happening in that region? So you can see where this can be confusing. And also, for the sake of the people who are in charge of running the town or the township or the city, whatever the jurisdiction happens to be, you can see where they want to have some kind of an idea, because then they can actually react to it. Years ago, I was a borough councilman, and I was able to see many times we'd have parade requests or things like that come through. Well, you'd be surprised how many issues come up with just a simple parade request, even like a little high school homecoming parade, which most people have no issue with a high school homecoming parade. But you start thinking of, well, what can happen? Well, there's a difference between a town street and a county road and a state highway or a U.S. highway or an interstate. And you can see as soon as you start dealing with those issues, you start dealing with different jurisdictions and different issues to handle those things. What are you going to do with traffic control? Like when you want to cross a street, are there going to be people who can efficiently and officially block traffic? How long will you be blocking traffic? If it's a major intersection, how will that be handled? If it's a state route, whose authority is needed to block that traffic? Do you have to have police there, or will somebody in a yellow vest be good enough? And you can start seeing, not just for the sake of the travel and the people's right to travel and do commerce, but also just strictly for the safety that comes into play there. I mean, there are some roads you could cross and not think twice about, but there's some roads that are really dangerous, like a 6-lane highway. That's not exactly easy. You want little children just shooting across that. So you can see why towns have that kind of interest in knowing how this group is going to be moving through. So that's where you look at what's in this case, but it's also important to note that it's reasonable. It's reasonable time, place, and manner. This is the way how one word can change everything, because just by saying, if you say that a town has the ability to do time, place, and manner, they can just say, okay, you go down to the industrial district down by the garbage dump. That's where you can have your protest. And you'll see that kind of stuff happening like on college campuses when they're told, no, you have to have provisions for free speech or things like that, or places to protest. And they'll find some little square way off in the distance and say, there's your free speech zone. If you want to do free speech, it's clear over there. Again, reasonable. If you're a mile away from everybody, well, what's your protest going to do? Well, you're just going to be talking to the air, So if you want to be able to protest, you should be able to be where people can hear and see you protest and maybe engage with, why are you protesting? You can have dialogue, discussion, debate, whatever you have in your protest. Or if you just want to peaceably assemble, you should be able to do so in a place that's conducive. If you send somebody off to the swamp, go assemble over there. Hang out with the mosquitoes and the snakes. I mean, that's not really conducive or safe for that either. So it's reasonable time, place, and manner. Again, this goes all the way back from 1941. So this is the landmark case, the ground setting case, the foundational case for all the protest cases that have really come since then. And so typically whenever you see this kind of case law that's so foundational, this landmark kind of case, most judges, whenever they look at protest or assembly, they go back to, well, what have previous, court cases held? And of course they look at landmark cases like Cox versus New Hampshire. So that's a key thing to be thinking of whenever we're doing protest. All right. That said, okay, so now I want to protest. I want to leave off the sidewalk. I want to protest on the street. Can I protest on a street? Again, if the town gives you permission, sure, absolutely. And they'll typically block off a certain section and say, this is your zone. You can go from this street down 3 blocks down to this street, and this is what you get. Or they could just say, you get 1 block or 5 blocks or whatever they tell you. They can set that thing. Or sometimes if the city doesn't want to deal with the logistical nightmare, they just allow it to happen. And sometimes you'll see that with protests that just show up and then people just start marching all over the place and taking over areas. And you're wondering, why aren't the police doing something about this? They're blocking traffic. They're doing all these other things. They're being disruptive. And sometimes the police just stand back. Well, that's because in those cases, the town leaders have just given a silent approval. They've just, instead of saying, well, stop, you need to have a permit, and then we'll give you this area and you can protest and assemble all you want. They just let it happen. So sometimes you will see that where they're just like, it's not worth the hassle. Just let them do their thing. As long as they're not being violent, just let them do their thing. Well, what about the situations where you do see protests kind of get violent and the police do nothing? Well, those are situations, of course, where now you have some serious issues because now you're looking at the town leaders just telling the police to stand down and not engage and let them do their thing. And it's basically no longer protesters because it's peaceable assembly, remember? And they become rioters at this point. And they've kind of sometimes just let them do their thing, get it out of their system, or because they politically agree with what they're doing. Well, doesn't that harm the people's businesses that are getting looted and burned down? Yes. But unfortunately, because the city hasn't done anything, now it's going to have to be a civil suit. Those businesses will have to sue the city or sue the police or sue the protesters or all of them to try to get some kind of compensation for what happened to their businesses and how they were impacted. So you end up seeing a situation where sometimes that does spill into that kind of a situation. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you are allowed to block a street if you have the permission, whether it's verbally given or written or just kind of with a wink and a nod. But what about blocking traffic? Can you block traffic? Well, again, that's one of those situations where I have a right to use a street. I have a right for commerce. I have a right for emergency. Maybe I'm a patient in an ambulance. I'd like to be able to go. So there's that right, and there's a right to protest and have the street. Well, who wins? Well, typically it's the streets are assumed to be used for cars, because that's why we build streets. We have sidewalks for walking, sidewalk, and the streets are made for cars. So it's assumed that if everyone stays in their proverbial lane, you're in good shape there. So you just have that kind of situation where that's where it's done. Now, like I said, though, a city can say, yes, we're going to give you this area of the section of street where you can have a protest. But sometimes you'll see often protesters blocking streets and the police doing nothing about it. That's a situation where either the leaders have said, we give you full permission to do so, or they've just tacitly given them permission by just not arresting them. So, but blocking a street in and of itself is typically very much, not acceptable because you are damaging someone else's right. You think, well, I have a right to do this, but you're damaging someone else's right. So there are provisions, again, going all the way back to Cox v. New Hampshire, where, look, there's reasonable time and place and manner to do things. And then your right is your right's covered. Your right is, fixed and good to go. Just because it's written that you have this right to peaceably assemble does not mean you get to trample someone else's rights. It's no longer peaceable when you're trampling someone else's rights. So that's what I want to talk to you today about the right to assemble, the right to protest, and a bedrock thing for our country. It's important to be able to do that. But we also have to understand that we have responsibilities when we protest. We have responsibilities when we assemble, that we can't trample other people's rights. So that's important to recognize that, if we're going to be civil, if we're going to be ethical, we need to be thinking of that as well. So thank you very much for tuning into Communicology. As always, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. I'd appreciate that. And if you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. I thank you for hanging around this long, but we'll catch you again next time.